Welcome to the Knowledge-Based Ninjas podcast, where Gauri Ramkumar of Document 360 finds the best SaaS self-service knowledge bases in the world and then interviews their creators. Let's get started with today's episode.
Welcome, everyone. Today's guest is Aaron Collier, a technical writer from Kiwi. Welcome, Aaron, to Knowledgeable Ninjas podcast. So how are you today?
Hi, thank you. I'm doing well today. Thank you. And how are you?
I'm good. Thank you, Aaron. So let's get started with the questions. So please share how you initially got into documentation.
Yes, I got into documentation from an education background. I started out teaching, and I was teaching at a university for a while, for 10 years. And I decided to get out of direct teaching. But one of the things I had done while teaching was working with teaching online and using mobile phones and LMSs to teach in different settings. And so I found that sort of technical approach to teaching was an interesting one for me. And so that led me to look for opportunities where I could put education and technical knowledge together, which led me to find, first I started out in a training program for the company that I worked for. I started out creating training programs for them, and then I moved over into more of a direct documentation for them. And that's how I got started. It was interesting because it allowed me to see how to teach people how to use things, teach people how to do things in a very direct way. It's interesting in that I'm still teaching people, learning things, and then teaching people how to do those things, but it's less of a direct interaction with people. So I think it's an interesting contrast to what I had been doing. And this was I was working previously at Kentico Software, where they make content as a service, which was offering software and content as a service to its users.
Okay, great. So that's a nice journey to know, Aaron. Thank you for sharing that with us. So what's your documentation process and who's involved in it normally?
Especially at Kentico, where I worked for the longest time on these kinds of things, we went through different kinds of processes. At first, we were working in a very agile way, where we were embedded within teams, and teams would come up with the teams with tasks. Like the teams would be implementing new features, and as part of that, we would see whether the documentation would have to change or not. But that left us with very good knowledge of what the teams were doing, but there was less interaction with other technical writers, and there was less progress on documentation as a whole. So what we did was we transitioned that to more of a separate team of documentation, a documentation team, which is actually a customer education team, where we worked on documentation tasks separately from the development teams. And there, what would happen is the development teams would come up with things that they thought needed to be documented. They would come up with lists of changes and things like that, and they would create tasks for us in our tracking software. We used Jira for that. They would create tasks for that, and then we would go through a process where we would prioritize those tasks and implement them, which gave us a chance to do the tasks for the development team, but also work on separate tasks, looking at the documentation as a whole and improving it and working on the portal and so on.
Fantastic. So what are the important factors you consider when creating documentation, either it being for your business or for any other solutions?
Important factors that we look at are things like what sort of educational impact it will have on people, like whether the documentation that we're creating is really going to help people accomplish something. We also look at whether it's like going to be a heavily used feature or not. Like if there's something that would require a lot of work, but only like 5% of our users use it, we will prioritize that lower. So we really want to try to work on the things that will have the most impact, that will make people be able to use the features as much as possible, and especially the most people to have the most impact is what we try to aim for.
Fantastic. So just hearing to what you said, what role does documentation have in your customer service or success strategy?
Yeah, the documentation, the customer education team was a part of the customer success department. We were really looking at it in terms of that customers wouldn't be able to be successful without proper documentation. Especially because it was an API first content management system. So it was really working on letting people manage their content through API. So without that kind of documentation of the API, first of all, they wouldn't be able to use the product at all. So in order for them to be successful, they needed to see that. But it's also an opportunity for us to, I wouldn't say market, but to show what the system is capable of, not just what a list of properties are in an API, but what you can do when you combine different kinds of things. So we looked at it as a way to show people what they were capable of and what they could accomplish through using the product. So we felt like it was really important for them to be successful, to see what was possible. And so we thought of documentation as a way to show people how to be successful. It's also important in terms of customer support, in terms of if they run into problems, here's how to troubleshoot these kinds of things. But what we were trying to push for is a way to show that maybe they've seen the product, but they didn't know it was capable of these things or that things. And so their projects wouldn't be successful without the documentation there to show them what they could do.
Great, yeah. So what kind of reduction in workload have you seen since introducing such quality documentations?
Well, I would say that we were able to shift focus to where we thought our work would have the most impact. So, in terms of the workload specifically, we are able to do the same kinds of things, but we're able to prioritize other tasks. Like we don't necessarily jump into fixing 100 different screenshots because of a small change in size or something like that. So we're able to free up some of that more repetitive tasks on little things that are less important to focus on the things that have the most impact, and that lets us improve the documentation experience as a whole, so that people are able to find what they want and be successful in doing the things that they really like doing.
Great. Yeah. So have you also seen a direct ROI? Now, I should admit that whoever I have spoken, especially when it comes to documentation, it's very hard to measure a direct ROI. But I'm just curious to know whether you have cracked that, and have you got any metrics that you said, okay, this is the direct ROI of adopting to a self-service knowledge base?
We tried a few different approaches to that kind of thing. I wouldn't say we were fully successful. Like we looked at people who were trying out the API and whether they were able to be successful on their first call, like whether they used the API and it returned an error or it didn't return an error. And then based on the documentation for that, we could look at it. We tried doing things like that. Or measuring whether people who read our documentation or specific arguments were more likely to try a given feature, or were more likely to be to feel that to be satisfied with the product, whether that had any impact. But we didn't find anything that we were able to use on a long-term basis, at least not yet. It's something they were planning on returning to in the future. But those were the kinds of things that we were looking at, whether we could find any evidence of people being successful in their use of the product, or especially, more feature adaptation and that kind of thing.
Great. So are you currently generating any organic search traffic from your knowledge base?
It is not. So I don't believe so. I think it's something that was a project that was planned for the future to look at more generalized documentation. If we have more time to work on those kinds of things, we would have, if we're working less on screenshots and those kinds of things, and we would have more time to work on more generic things that might drive that kind of traffic. But it's not something that we had a lot of at the moment.
Okay. All right. So that's great. So now going on to our rapid fire round. Let's shoot those 3 questions. Who have you learned the most about documentation from in your career?
I would say the people I was working with, especially Honza Serman, I would say was one of the people who taught me the most about it. But also I would say the Write the Docs community is an amazing community filled with many people that I've learned a lot from.
Fantastic. Can you share a documentation related resource you have consumed recently?
Well, in the Write the Docs community, there's a book group where we're reading a book that's called the Product is Docs, or the Product as Docs. And I found it very useful so far.
Super. So what is the one piece of documentation related advice you would give to your 20-year-old self?
Well, first of all, I would have to tell my 20-year-old self that it was an option because, like I said, I spent a long time teaching and I didn't know that it was an option. So I think to just try it, to combine writing and trying documentation, and don't worry that you won't know things because you'll just keep learning for the rest of your documentation career.
Great. That's nice, Aaron, because as you rightly said, nobody knows there is a profession called documentation or document writer, isn't it? So documentation manager to say so. But that becomes like a core piece of your whole success story, right? For any organization, good piece of document you have for your product that sells half of your product. So very well said. So I think that's all with my questions. Once again, thank you, Aaron, for joining this short journey with us and, of course, sharing your unique experience. Do you have anything else to add to this podcast?
Not that I can think of right now. So thank you for having me on.
Fantastic. Thank you. Thank you, Aaron. Have a great day.
You too. Bye-bye.
Thanks for listening to today's episode of the Knowledge Base Ninjas podcast. Please head to iTunes, rate, and provide honest feedback on the podcast. See you next week.